Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. And before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of the hearing. First, members should keep their video feed on for as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. And finally, if members have documents that they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. Well, good morning and welcome to our members and our panelists. I especially appreciate your willingness to have the hearing rescheduled to a time when nothing is happening in Washington, D.C. and Congress. But thank you all for joining us for this hearing on researcher access to social media data. For years, experts have been raising the alarm about how misinformation and disinformation spreads unabated on social media platforms. Long before fake news was an epithet aimed at influencing anything conflicting with someone's own worldview. It described falsehoods presented maliciously as fact in order to influence opinions. The problem of misinformation is not a new one, but social media has fanned the flames, and it is now difficult to imagine political and social discourse untouched by its influence. The damage caused by misinformation reaches far beyond our phone and computer screens. Lies on social media have spawned riots and ethnic cleansing and thousands of deaths around the world, and lies about the 2020 election inspired thousands to invade our Capitol on January 6th in an attempt to disrupt our Constitution and stop the certification of valid election results, resulting in 5 deaths. Lies about the severity of COVID-19 prevented millions of Americans from taking the disease seriously, resulting in needless infections and needless deaths. Vaccine disinformation is discouraging Americans from receiving safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines, extending the pandemic and allowing new variants to proliferate. For years, we have seen the harmful effects of anti-vaccine rhetoric, causing the reemergence of diseases like measles that had been eliminated by vaccines. In fact, in July, the Surgeon General declared that misinformation on social media was a public health hazard. Much of this misinformation, in fact, appears to be generated and amplified by our enemies who recognize the damage that it does to our country. It is therefore imperative that the Science Committee address it as we would any other threat to public health by ensuring that we have the best and brightest minds researching the problem so that we can base future policy on the best available evidence. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult for researchers to gain sufficient access to social media data. Companies do make some information public, but it is largely through interfaces that they control, meaning that researchers can only see what the companies want them to see, and access can be cut off at any time. Today, we'll hear from our witnesses about the research that they are able to conduct in this environment. They will tell us about the limitations of the existing tools and what data they believe can and should be made public, so that we can have a better understanding of how social media users interact with misinformation and how that impacts their behavior online and offline. We will hear about how mis and disinformation is delivered to social media users through the black box of the algorithm, drawing eyes to the sensationalist content that inspires the most user engagement, regardless of truth. We on the Science Committee understand that the very real limitations to full data transparency by social media is a real problem. Platforms will argue that some information should be protected as trade secrets, much as the computerized financial trading firms prize the opacity behind their sometimes abusive trading algorithms. At the same time, social media users are entitled to privacy, particularly of personally identifiable information. However, these concerns cannot be broad excuses to shield social media companies from a full outside accounting of how their platforms may be endangering public health and safety. We simply cannot leave social media unstudied. It is as influential a force on the social fabric of the 21st century as any other. But as it stands, advertisers on these platforms often enjoy more access to data than academic researchers looking to access the impact of promoted posts. I believe that in this hearing, we can have a constructive launching point to explore how the Science Committee can contribute to this conversation. We must strike a balance between protecting user privacy and confidential business information while also acknowledging that objective, independent research is necessary to understand how these platforms influence modern society. We've solved this problem for electronic trading and financial services. We are solving this problem for academic access to electronic health records, and we must solve this problem here. I look forward to hearing from our panelists about how we can support their important work of shining a light onto the disinformation black box that is poisoning our public discourse. And I now yield it to Ranking Member Obernolte for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Foster, and thank you to our witnesses for being here at this very important hearing, and what will prove, I'm sure, to be a fascinating hearing on combating the spread of misinformation on social media. We live in an amazing world, a world where we are presented with a selected, curated news feed that only includes the things that we're personally interested in. And that's informed by algorithms that companies like social media have come up with to foster user engagement and to maximize our interest in the information that's being provided. But unfortunately, as the chairman pointed out, that's also catalyzed the spread of misinformation. Combating that spread is something that has been a societal problem for hundreds of years now, but it's exacerbated by the fact that information now spreads so easily, and that information is personalized to each one of us. So the information that I see in the morning is not the same thing that the information that other people see in the morning. And unfortunately, that can hide and mask the spread of this misinformation. And if you want a perfect example of how that can be problematic, you can look at a hearing that this subcommittee held a couple of weeks ago on the origins of COVID. And one of the, for me, the very surprising outcomes of that committee hearing was the fact that although we had competing theories about the spread of COVID, that any theory other than natural zoonotic origin had been rejected early in the crisis as misinformation and had been labeled a conspiracy theory, and that the social media companies had actively suppressed the spread of that information. And now, with the benefit of hindsight and the discovery of new data, we've discovered that competing theories are not only possible, but indeed plausible, and in fact, might end up being the successful theory. So no one can deny that this effort to combat the spread of misinformation has severely hampered our ability to identify the origins of COVID. And it just illustrates how these two ideas are in tension, right? On one hand, we want to be a society that honors the exercise of free speech, but that is fundamentally in tension with the idea that we also have an obligation to stop the spread of misinformation. So I'm hopeful that some of our panelists today will be able to talk some more about kind of that, where that moral boundary is, and figuring out as a society how to balance those two competing interests, I think is critical. Because on the one hand, as recent events have shown, we all have a vested interest in trying to figure out how to stop the spread of misinformation. But on the other hand, history has shown us repeatedly that if we allow censorship to take the place of misinformation, that will take us down a very dark path as a society. So we have to find this middle ground, this balance in between the two. And I'm confident that we can. And I'm also confident that the social media companies like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are going to be critical to helping us solve this problem, because they have the expert knowledge in the way their algorithms work. They have the expert knowledge in the way that this information spreads and what catalyzes people's interest in news about the world around them. And so I think definitely that they're going to need a seat at the table. We're going to need to tap all of our available sources of information, which certainly includes them, but also includes the independent researchers we're going to hear from today. And I'm very thankful that they're out there gathering this information to give us a holistic view of this problem. So I am looking very much forward to the hearing and looking forward to asking questions afterwards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And we are honored to have the full committee chairwoman, Ms. Johnson, with us today. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman for an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me say good morning and greet our panelists and thank you for holding this hearing. The topic will only grow in relevance as social media becomes all the more ingrained in our lives, and worryingly, these issues will become more dangerous with every topic that becomes hotly politicalized. Disinformation has been a public health threat for decades. Experts estimate that 330,000 deaths from AIDS in the early 200s can be attributed to disinformation about the connection between HIV and AIDS. The fact of human-caused climate change, with decades of empirical evidence and expert consensus behind it, has nevertheless become a subject of great debate. Moneyed interests fan the flames of doubt as oceans rise and forests burn. And now, as we conduct this hearing virtually due to a surge in COVID-19, conspiracy theorists and malicious actors spread lies about the severity of the pandemic. Laymen speculate wildly about the vaccine's safety, drowning out expert voices. Social media offers fertile ground for these falsehoods and unfounded claims that can spread across the globe in a blink of an eye. We must not leave the black box of social media disinformation unexamined. Navigating the difficulties and extending access to data will not be easy, but failing to do so will have devastating consequences. This current moment is a grave example of the stakes at hand. We will not beat the pandemic without increased vaccine uptake, and every day, social media users are dissuaded from getting the shot after seeing deeply misinformed posts. People are making decisions for the health and safety of themselves, their families, and their communities based on an abject falsehoods. And researchers determined to mitigate the damage are unable to access critical data on how these lies spread. I am pleased to join you and others, Chairman Foster, in welcoming our witnesses today. They're doing important research into how misinformation circulates online and impacts our real world health and safety. I look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. And if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Alan Mislove. Dr. Mislove is a professor, the interim dean at the Khoury College of Computer Sciences at Northeastern University. His primary field of interest concerns distributed systems and networks with a focus on using social networks to enhance the security, privacy, and efficiency of newly emerging systems.
This is background.
He is also a core faculty member of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute, which forges global partnerships with experts in industry, government, and academia. After Dr. Mislove is Ms. Laura Edelson. Ms. Edelson is a Ph.D. candidate in computer science at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. Laura studies online political communication and develops methods to identify inauthentic content and activity. Her research has informed reporting on social media ad spending in several national papers, including the New York Times. Prior to rejoining academia, Ms. Edelson was a software engineer for Palantir and FactSet, with a focus on applied machine learning and big data. Our final witness is Dr. Kevin Leicht. Dr. Leicht is a professor and former head of the Sociology Department at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and director of the Iowa Social Science Research Center at the University of Iowa. That's some commute. He previously served as a program officer for the Sociology and Resource Implementations for data-intensive research, the data-intensive research program at the National Science Foundation. He has written extensively on issues related to economic development, globalization, and political sociology. As our witnesses should know, they each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And now we will start with Dr. Mislove. Dr. Mislove provides his testimony. Proceed.
Chairman Foster, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Obernotti, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Alan Mislove. I'm a professor and interim dean of the Khoury College of Computer Sciences at Northeastern University. My research is on algorithmic auditing. I develop methodologies that allow me to study large online platforms, such as those operated by social media companies, to better understand how they work, how they may be abused, and what impacts they are having on users. Importantly, I conduct my research independently, without companies' permission and without insider access to data. Put simply, I have no more access to these platforms than any of you do. This is a significant challenge. It is difficult to develop the technologies that enable my work, especially because companies are resistant to external accountability, and we work in a legal environment that makes such research carry non-trivial risk. As social media platforms mediate an increasingly large fraction of online communication, independent research such as this is critical. Even in the best of worlds, understanding how these platforms are impacting end users and society is too big a task for the platforms themselves. Though much remains to be done, my group and collaborators have been successful at studying a variety of such platforms, identifying alarming behaviors, and working with platforms to make improvements. Thus, I am well positioned to provide input on what can currently be measured and what is needed going forward to ensure we fully understand the impact that platforms are having. So that you can appreciate how we conduct our research, we typically study platforms using one of two approaches. We can recruit cohorts of users who agree to donate their data, or we can run our own experiments on the platforms, for example, by becoming an advertiser. Unfortunately, both of these approaches that we have today have significant limitations. Running our own experiments is often expensive in terms of time and money, requires significant expertise, and is beyond the capabilities of many researchers and regulators. Worse, platforms often actively try to prevent such data collection, have suspended researchers' accounts, and have threatened litigation for ethical research in the public interest, with a notable exception, or example being one of my fellow witnesses. Platforms may say that researchers can rely on aggregated data that they provide, but this statement is misleading at best. Social media platforms have been very hesitant to release any data and have often only released aggregated coarse-grained data in the face of scandal and public backlash. Often, even accessing the data they do release can be challenging. In many cases, datasets require approval from the platform to be able to access and cannot be shared with other researchers. Moreover, recent events have shown that platforms cannot be trusted to provide even correct aggregated data. It was recently revealed that Facebook neglected to include data from half of the US population, one of the datasets it provided, calling numerous studies that relied on that dataset into question. The upshot is that currently no regulations exist that require platforms to make data available, and platforms are actively attacking independent researchers' ability to study their impacts. In effect, researchers are relying on platforms' goodwill to allow studies to be run at all, a situation that is becoming less and less tenable as platforms become more entrenched. Thus, my key message is that researchers need Congress to enshrine into law requirements for platforms to make data available. Mandating such transparency requires nuance, but is both feasible and urgent. In particular, I want to convey 3 key considerations for how to shape such requirements. First, social media platforms sit inside broader socio-technical systems, and the data that regulations require to be made available must be comprehensive enough to recognize the complexity of such systems. For example, platforms are typically funded via advertising, and any transparency requirement should cover both organic and paid content. Second, social media platforms allow numerous types of content to be exchanged, and one-size-fits-all approaches to the kind of metadata that must be made available are unworkable. Instead, the kind of data required to be released must be tailored to the particular type of content. Ads, pages, shared URLs, and so forth all have different types of metadata that needs to be shared. Third, transparency over who sees the content is crucial to understand platforms' impact. While existing data have focused primarily on the content itself, making aggregate data on the demographics of who is being shown the content is equally as important, as it's necessary to be able to understand the platform's impact on end users. In summary, Social media platforms do not currently have the proper incentives to allow research on their platforms and have been observed to be actively hostile to important ethical research that is in the public interest. At the same time that platforms' power and influence is reaching new heights, our ability as independent researchers to understand the impacts that they're having is being reduced each day. We need Congress's help to enable researchers to have sufficient access to data from social media platforms in order to ensure that the benefits of these platforms do not come at a cost that is too high for society to bear. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And next is Ms. Edelson.
Good afternoon. Good morning, Chairman Foster, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Ober-Nolte, and the members of the subcommittee. My name is Laura Edelson. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in computer science, where I also co-lead the Cybersecurity for Democracy project, and I'm a Belfer Fellow with the Anti-Defamation League. As cybersecurity researchers, my team and I study systemic vulnerabilities in online platforms that expose people to misleading and false claims, from fake COVID cures to voting disinformation to investment scams, primarily on Facebook. Our ultimate goal is to develop workable solutions to digital mis and disinformation. Members of this committee will understand that in order to do this, we need concrete data and the ability to engage in rigorous scientific inquiry of that data. And lack of data is currently the most serious barrier to the work of misinformation researchers. Twitter is the only major social media platform that allows most researchers access to public data on their platform, albeit at a high financial cost. In 2016, Facebook bought a company called CrowdTangle that offered access to public Facebook data, and it still operates their offering. However, very few researchers are allowed to access this tool. It's primarily offered as a business intelligence product. Most other platforms, including YouTube and TikTok, simply offer nothing. In the face of this black box, some researchers, including my team, Mozilla, and news outlets like The Markup, have attempted to crowdsource data about what happens on social media. We have been met in some cases with outright hostility from the platforms we study. This summer, after months of legal threats, Facebook cut off my team's access to their data. We are far from the only research team that's been stopped. Algorithm Watch in Germany was forced to shutter their work entirely after Facebook threatened legal action against them. Many other researchers who would like to study Facebook at this point are frozen out. They simply can't afford a legal battle with one of the most powerful corporations in the world. We had used the data we got from Facebook to support the finding in our most recent study that posts from misinformation sources got 6 times more engagement than that of factual news, to identify security vulnerabilities that we reported to Facebook, and to monitor Facebook's own public-facing ad library for political ads. Every day that my team can't access the data we need to do our work puts us further behind in the race to find answers. And make no mistake, the harm being caused by misinformation and hate online is very real. In 2019, journalist Jeremy Merrill reported that conservative retirees were targeted with misleading claims in Facebook ads and then guided to sites to convince them to trade in their retirement funds for precious metals with a company called metals.com. In the summer of 2020, an advertiser on Facebook called Protect My Vote ran ads discrediting mail-in balloting that were aimed at African-American voters in the upper Midwest. A report from the Anti-Defamation League found that exposure to videos from extremist or white supremacist channels on YouTube remains common, with 1 in 10 study participants being exposed. And nearly 40% of Latinx respondents said that they'd seen material that makes them think that the COVID vaccine is not safe or effective, according to a study earlier this year. But I know I don't need to remind any of you who experienced the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th of the high costs of misinformation to our social fabric. Facebook particularly is a selective megaphone. Their own internal research has shown that the way they have built their algorithm disproportionately promotes misinformation and extreme content. To study these issues, all researchers need access to much more data than Facebook or most other platforms provide. Facebook should strengthen CrowdTangle by adding data about user platforms and broaden access to it so that researchers from all institutions can use it. Other companies like Google and TikTok should make public data about their platforms accessible to researchers as soon as possible. Facebook needs to reinstate my team's accounts immediately so that we can resume our work. And while we hope this will happen soon, we must also acknowledge that platforms' attempts at voluntary transparency have failed. It's time for Congress to act to ensure that researchers and the public have access to data that we need to protect ourselves from online misinformation. I believe we will look back and see this moment in history as a turning point when the costs of disinformation and hate online became too great to ignore, and we stepped up and took action. Previous generations of Americans have taken on public health crises like cancer or drunk driving, and science has helped us to meet tough challenges like this. It has helped us to save lives and to make the lives we save more enjoyable and fulfilling. Science can help us now, but only if we provide researchers the data that they need to study and describe the problems we face. In closing, I want to thank the committee for their attention to these issues and also for the opportunity to share my experience and perspective.
Thank you. And after Ms. Edelson is Dr. Leicht.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the committee for inviting me. My name is Kevin Leicht. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Champaign, Urbana. And I have assembled a multidisciplinary team that is studying how misinformation spreads through social media platforms and what effect labeling has on dampening the spread of that misinformation. What my group of social scientists, computer scientists, and journalists and business professors has found is that consistent labeling by social media platforms about COVID-19 severity, transmission, vaccinations, and cures is somewhat effective at preventing the spread of suspect social media posts. But because of Facebook's algorithms and our lack of access to them, we can't really tell whether reduced sharing of suspect posts is due to Facebook's algorithm or changes in actual user behavior. And this unsatisfying outcome is probably why I was invited to speak to you today. So we know quite a bit about how misinformation spreads. So we know it's not necessarily spread by nefarious individuals on the dark web, and we know what types of people are susceptible to consuming misinformation. We also know that combating misinformation is harder the more misinformation is repeated. So it becomes harder and harder to stop. But as our prior two testifiers have said, social media platforms keep their data to themselves, and they do research internally that is not disclosed. The platforms do offer places to download such data, but much of the research happens in lab settings where researchers tightly control what people see, which is valuable, but is not really what happens in the real world of social media consumption. With the black box algorithms that social media platforms use, users get vastly different exposures to different types of information, and we are left studying what users do with bits of information without knowing exactly what the stimulus is that's prompting them to share this misinformation. There are deficiencies in the tools needed to do this research, the data availability, which has already been discussed, and there's an overall lack of coordination in the study of social media information and data collection. The data availability part, as our prior presenters have said, is important for independent research. The simple answer to this problem when I talk to outsiders is I say this: we didn't trust the Tobacco Institute to tell us about the safety of smoking. We probably shouldn't rely on social media companies for research on what social media does. That research needs to be done independently. They have a built-in conflict of interest with regard to this research, as their purpose is to draw attention and eyes, and the information that draws attention and eyes sells advertising. The biggest gap that we see in doing research is in the data and algorithms, or the black box the social media companies use to determine what end users see. And at some level, we need access not only to the data, but to the black box. There are some things the federal government can do, I think, to help social media researchers and allow independent social media research to be done, which I think is vitally important. The strategy my group thinks of would combine action by the federal government to compel the social media companies to share data, contributions by the social media providers themselves, help from private foundations, and help from private federal science funders. The federal government could require the platforms to provide data to research groups who are investigating public interest questions about misinformation incidents, prevalence, and consequences, And this data sharing could take many forms. There could be we could see the creations, for example, of central data depositories like we have in astronomy, for example, or in other social science areas, where there are depositories that act as a basic infrastructure for studying social media information. So people don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they want to study social media information, collect their own misinformation, deal with or deal with the possible legal consequences and everything else. And the access to this data could be through some sort of cloud computing format with strict human subjects protocols. So many more researchers would have access and they wouldn't have to jump through the hoops that our group has had to jump through here. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And at this point, we will begin our first round of questions. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. I'd like to start out my questions by entering a statement for the record prepared by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which studies how dangerous content spreads online and harms society at large, whether it be offensive hate speech or misinformation aimed to change people's beliefs and behaviors for the worse. So I ask unanimous consent for that statement to be entered into the record. Hearing none, so ordered. And now on to my questions. Dr. Mislove, in your research, you have purchased ads on Facebook and used the performance metrics to gain insight into the algorithm that determines who actually sees the ads. You noted in your testimony that your team has spent over $25,000 running ads. Frankly, it strikes me odd that researchers are in the position of having to pay the subject of their study in order to gain sufficient access to crucial data. So first, how do the metrics available to you as a paying advertiser differ from those that are available to researchers who are not paying for privileged access? Or what forced you to go and decide to spend money here?
So thank you for the question, Chairman Foster. You're precisely right. We have used the advertising system as a methodology. The reason is that if you are not using that and using the publicly facing data, the most useful thing is what's called the ad library. Laura alluded to that. That only gives extremely coarse-grained statistics on active ads. You can't look back. You get no idea of the breakdown of who's actually seeing the ad, their gender, and delivery location. When you become an advertiser, you get access to much more fine-grained data. For every ad you run, Facebook gives you very detailed information about how much money is being spent on that ad, the demographic makeup of who is being shown it. And that is what we use as the basis of understanding the delivery algorithm itself. In other words, the decisions that Facebook is making about which users get to see which ads.
Do you ever worry that Facebook knows who you are and might sort of give you a warped view of the way they treat advertisers?
That's a fantastic question, and we do. We actually sometimes use multiple accounts, some of which we don't reveal to Facebook to make sure that we're seeing consistent behavior across those accounts. But yes, we do worry a little.
Worry about it. Okay. Yeah, I think some of the ride-sharing companies a while ago got caught doing things like that. Precisely. Is there an ethical or privacy-related reason to share more data with paying advertisers than researchers?
There's no user privacy related reason to do so. The statistics we get back do not tell us anything about the actual people who see our ads. Again, it's just fraction of men, fraction of women. Facebook will claim that there is, and I think Laura may have some words about that, but when they say that, they're protecting the privacy of advertisers, not the privacy of end users.
Okay, is there an agreed upon list that's about what sort of information that is available to advertisers now that should just be automatically be available to researchers? Would that be a reasonable mandate for social media generally?
I don't know that such a list exists right now, but it would not be difficult to develop exactly such a list. They already released certain metrics, and I would argue that there are a number of others that we already have access to in various ways that could become the basis of such a list.
Dr. Edelson, in your testimony, you mentioned CrowdTangle and Twitter's Firehose API being primarily business analytic tools. Are businesses getting access to information that researchers aren't when these tools are being throttled or not made available to researchers? And how does their intent, their design intent as business analytic tools limit their usefulness to researchers?
Thank you for the question. So in short, yes. We found CrowdTangle to be quite a rich tool for studying user engagement. And it was quite illuminating for that purpose. But as researchers, we don't just want to be able to, come to this conclusion, misinformation is very engaging. We would also like to be able to understand, start to be able to understand how we could stop that, how we could design systems to make misinformation maybe less engaging. And in order to do that, one of the things that we really need is impression data. This is something that would be really, really crucial to actually start getting to solutions. And it's something that Facebook doesn't make available through CrowdTangle. If I could just speak very quickly to the prior question about ad data, I actually published. I have a preprint of a paper that's available that is a technical standard for what data could be made available about ads. I'd be happy to forward that on to you. It's going to be published in the next couple of months formally.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will now recognize Ranking Member Overt for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses. This has been a very interesting hearing. Let me start with Ms. Edelson. You had something in your written testimony that you didn't have time to bring up in your oral testimony, in which you made some recommendations about things that can be done to facilitate access to information. And one of the things that you proposed was to create a legal safe harbor for researchers in working with this data. And I wanted to give you a platform to elaborate a little bit on that. But if you could also, as you talk about that, if you could talk about whether or not that legal safe harbor should also apply to the platforms themselves, since ostensibly they would be giving you that data that could create liability for them as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good one. So the researcher safe harbor proposal that the Knight First Amendment group and I have called for would provide legal protections to researchers like me who engage in direct study of platforms by using it. I think that's the general thrust. There are many excellent researchers who do really important ethnographic work. I'm thinking particularly of Joan Donovan out of Harvard, who does really good work studying militia groups, how they recruit, other extremist groups like this. And this would provide cover to these researchers for their work so that, again, within bounds, that they handle data responsibly, that their work is overseen by institutional review boards, that is within ethical boundaries. As to whether platforms themselves would need legal cover, I think in general, I would need to go back and talk to the lawyers about that. To my knowledge, in general, we're covering data that is generally accessible. So I actually don't know if that would be required.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so yeah, you brought up the institutional review boards, which is something else I have a question about. Just because when I got my doctorate, my research was qualitative and only involved interviews. And yet my IRB gave me a hard time about that data. I can't imagine what yours did to you. I have a question for Dr. Mislove. In your oral testimony, you discussed the fact that running experiments on the platform is beyond the capabilities of a lot of researchers. And yet that seems to be the only way that we can get really unbiased data, because even if we ask the platform owners for data, we have a concern that the data that we're going to get back is biased in some way, just the same way if you ask a cigarette manufacturer whether or not tobacco use was safe, you wouldn't necessarily trust the veracity of that data. I have a further concern about this, though, and as a computer scientist myself, a lot of these algorithms are interconnected. You can't create a fake user and run some tests about what liking this does or what not liking that does, and to see how the algorithm works without affecting real users' pages, right? Because all of that data feeds back into it. So we kind of got this quantum mechanical situation where the act of observing the system is influencing the behavior of the system. As a researcher, how do you combat that?
Those are fantastic questions. Thank you for them. So to address your sort of the first question about sort of the ability to study these, we are able to do it, but the limitation is when we become an advertiser, we're only really able to say what happens to our own ads, right? So it's much harder for us to go beyond that and say, okay, this is the kinds of effects we're seeing on other advertisers' ads. So we really can speak to the algorithm a bit, but we can't speak to sort of its impacts on users in many cases. To your second question around sort of the feedback loops and these sorts of quantum mechanical effects as you described them, that's exactly right. And we think very much about that. To give you one example, one of the things we worried about is how much, like teasing out how much of the effects we see are due to users who engage with the content versus the algorithms that actually choose who to deliver it to. And Kevin had alluded to that in his testimony. We have come up with a number of cute tricks to be able to sort of tease those out in many cases, where we can sort of make sure that ads show up as the same to individual users, so we know the users can't react any differently, but the algorithm will see them differently. So there are ways in certain cases we can get around that, but it's something we take into account every time.
Oh, very interesting. Well, Mr. Chair, it looks like the clock is malfunctioning, which I guess is a good thing for me. But I'm just going to ask one final question and open it up to the whole panel to answer. The end goal here is, of the research you're doing, I think, is not only to understand how misinformation spreads, but to enable us to reach some kind of societal solution to halting the spread of misinformation without suppressing free speech. And I think we can get there, right? We've done that in other venues. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's now recognized as something that's not an infringement on people's free speech because of its potential to cause harm. And I think we're going to reach some kind of standard with that as pertains to online misinformation. And I think just like we did there, it's going to revolve around the intent of the poster of that misinformation. But I'm wondering if you could weigh in, and anyone would like to, about what you think that ultimate solution is going to look like.
Can I take a stab at that one? One of the things my group thinks about in that regard, about how to balance the relationship between controlling misinformation and censorship, is to think about simply coming up with more effective labels. So people can post and basically spread anything that they want, so the communication itself is not censored. But one of the things that stops misinformation from spreading is often the cognitive interference of actually labeling this and say, are you sure you want to spread this or not? But I actually think even something like that is going to have to be fairly conservative. So there will be some types of misinformation that are simply not in the public interest to control or necessarily stop the spread of, and others that's more vital for, say, the public health or the public safety. So that would sort of be my group's way of dealing with this conundrum.
Ms. Edelson, go ahead.
So one of my very recent studies, one of our key findings was that misinformation outperformed factual content on Facebook. But the real meat of this was true for every partisan category. So far-right misinformation outperforms far-right factual content. Far-left misinformation outperforms far-left factual content. So I think we all want to get to a place where misinformation isn't prioritized. It is not in the fast lane against factual content. And we can do this without discriminating based on viewpoint or suppressing certain opinions, or certainly suppressing facts, as you've spoken to. I think what we need to get to is a place where engagement, user interactions is not the driving force of what content is promoted.
Right. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I'll look forward to the rest of the questions. Despite what's on the clock, I'm sure I'm out of time. So, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I guess if there's member interest, we can certainly entertain a second round of questions here, because this is, I can't imagine a more important subject actually right now. And so I'll now recognize my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Kasten, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses here. This is really fascinating. About 3 years ago, the relevant that this was before COVID, and I feel somewhat prescient in an angry way. Mark Zuckerberg testified before a financial services committee, and I asked him in the first instance whether they would suppress anti-vaccine information if it came from Jenny McCarthy's Facebook page, and then separately whether they would suppress information from the American Nazi Party if it came from Art Jones' Facebook page. Art Jones at the time had just won the Republican nomination to run for Congress in Illinois' 3rd congressional district. His answers were unsatisfactory and seemed to suggest that the content of the information was one question, the speaker was another. I mention that because the recent Wall Street Journal reporting that they are in fact whitelisting certain high-profile people suggests that this problem has not been solved. And I'd like to start just with Ms. Edelson, because it sounds like you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Do you see a disparate approach to information protocols depending on the speaker in your research as we sit right now? Sorry, I think you're muted.
There certainly currently exists, as we all now know, 2 separate systems on Facebook where some speakers are effectively not moderated at all, and then there's everyone else. I think this is almost entirely backwards because what Facebook has set up is a situation where these speakers who have the widest reach are free to spread, whatever lies they choose. And it will take a long time for Facebook to act, and often Facebook won't act at all. I think that this is where I think there is a difference in how we think about content moderation versus how we think about content promotion. I think that speakers that have a bigger audience should have a bigger responsibility to ensure that the information that the platforms spread on their behalf to their audiences is factual.
Yeah, I think we're all fond of the framing that freedom of speech and freedom of reach are 2 separate things. And I think sometimes we allow them to amplify horrible messages that would go away if we just limited to freedom of speech. My next question, I want to start with Mr. Mislove, but if we have time, I'd love all of your thoughts on this. I totally agree with your idea that we should have this data shared and available for research. At the same time, there's an implicit premise behind that says that the data we provide on social media platforms does not belong to us, and the custodian of that data is now the firm that has the data. And I personally have been rather persuaded by Roger McNamee in his writing that if we essentially made sure that everybody is the custodian of your own data and all of your own metadata and all of that data was portable, we would essentially end up with a much healthier social media environment, because essentially there wouldn't be this walled garden and the conflict of interest where the company that has information about where you traveled last week, who you were with, what you bought, had that information to share. And I realize that's a long list and gets a little bit beyond the purview of this committee. But if we were to wave a wand tomorrow and change the premise such that everybody owned their own data, that they could opt into sharing that data and the metadata around their data, so that they truly had portability, so that they could still say, I actually find it useful that this device knows where I am and where I want to go and can have all the automated. If we were to do all that, does that change the environment that you would have where essentially we would have to get sort of permission for the data from the public rather from the companies that we have, without really questioning, assumed that they're the custodians of the data? So Mr. Mislove, start with you, because I see you nodding your head so vigorously, but I'd welcome all of your thoughts on that question.
That's a great question. I'm sure my other panelists will have similar thoughts. So one is that what you're talking about is essentially sort of democratizing the ownership of data, which there have been a number of proposals to do, at least in the computer science research literature. Those sorts of things have some technical challenges, but I think those are solvable. But I think one way you could move towards that is give users legal rights over the data that these companies already have on them. So for example, Facebook allows you to extract your data from the site, but there's many things they don't provide you. We have some information on that. And this, if you allowed users to have the legal right to say, give me all of your data on me, that would enable many more research studies, because you could then get users to contribute their data themselves with consent and so forth. So that, what you're saying, I think there's a number of different ways to tackle it, but it would make significant progress progress towards enabling researchers to be able to study these systems.
And I realize we're out of time and we may come back, but I would be curious if that changes, because now every individual user would have to consent to sharing the data with you to do their research, as opposed to saying to Facebook, just give me the data.
Absolutely. I mean, in some ways it would make it more challenging, but at the same time, we've done those sorts of studies. Like we've recruited users. Laura has a whole study where she did exactly that. So there's precedent for doing it, and it's something we're used to doing.
Okay, well, I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now recognize my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple comments and then some questions. So one, I have to applaud our ranking member and our chair, and to the panel. It is the science committee, and between the two of them, they are able to weave in quantum mechanics and usually the theory of relativity into every panel. So, and I want to congratulate the ranking member on getting quantum mechanics into this panel. So number one. Number two, to the ranking member, and I guess the concern I have and the general concern that you've raised about misinformation and censorship. I think in this day and age, I'm very concerned about the big lie, about Joseph Goebbels and the ability to promote and promulgate and propagate the big lie. And so I'll start with you, Ms. Edelson. And, obviously the Anti-Defamation League is something always concerned about the truth. So you said in your op-ed in the Times, in the course of our overall research, we've been able to demonstrate that extreme, unreliable news sources get more engagement, user interaction on Facebook at the expense of accurate posts and reporting. What's more, our work shows that the archive of political ads that Facebook makes available to researchers is missing more than 100,000 ads. Can you elaborate on those two sentences? First about, and you've talked about it a little bit, but how do you know that this misinformation really is able to spread farther and faster than accurate stuff? You're muted.
So the way that we know that is we used Facebook's own tools. We used Facebook's own business intelligence tools for understanding how content spreads, how it engages, because that is very much what Facebook wants its users to do. It wants its users who create content to create as engaging content as possible, because that is Facebook's business model. It is a user engagement maximization engine, and then it sells that engagement to advertisers. So we used those tools to study, what Facebook told us their users interacted with the most. And that is what we found. I want to be clear about one thing. I don't think Facebook chooses to promote, it has not sat down and made the choice, we will promote misinformation. What it has done is it has chosen to promote the most engaging content. And when its own internal research told it that the most engaging content was misinformation, it was the most polarizing content, it was hateful content, it didn't do anything about it. It was a conscious choice not to take steps that would increase the quality of its information ecosystem, but would also decrease engagement. And the reason why is ads. Ads are Facebook's business. And, one of the reasons that finding that there are many ads and advertisers who slip through the cracks is that Facebook isn't willing to make its ad platform more secure, more trustworthy, because that would make its ad experience worse and it would cost it money.
So let me just stop you, because I've got all scientists on here, or engineers, except I'm the lawyer. And at some point it moves from unintentional to intentional. And so that would be my argument. And so I want to turn to Professor Leicht for a second. So, and a number of you brought up, would you trust the information that you might get from the Tobacco Institute? And here, so now Ms. Edelson is relying on their tools. How would you approach this thing? Would it be any different than she has? to try to figure out what's going on here? I mean, she's used their own tools to prove a case against them.
Yes, well, I would trust her research in part because the tools are an integral part of their business model. So if the tools don't work somehow or don't promote more engagement, then the company doesn't make as much money. So unless through the tools they are somehow feeding her false information that's specifically bespoke and just sent to her, I would be inclined to trust that. But it is another situation where we are basically trusting them. But on the other hand, some of what she's getting access to is sort of behind the wall or behind the veil, and it's tied to how they make money. So I tend to trust that.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
All right, and I guess we now have time for a second round of questions. So I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. The first question, how do you publish information here? Where the tools that you use are likely to be altered or abolished underneath, your feet. And so, scientific reproducibility, it's the touchstone of everything, seems to be hard to get to. And some of you touched on that in your testimony. I'm just wondering what the conflicts you see there and the reasonable solutions to them. Any one of you just
to clarify, did you mean that how do we study this system when it's changing constantly and our access could be revoked at any moment?
Correct, and that the access may not be granted someone who wants to reproduce your results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that you're absolutely right. That's a real problem for us. When we act as an advertiser, we keep logs of everything. So we get copies of all of the data on our ads because our accounts could be shut down at any moment, and as a result, we lose access to our scientific data. But it is challenging because there are other features of the platform that one can only access when one has been in the platform for a long time. And so we have access to some of those. And that would mean that other groups would have significant trouble being able to reproduce our results. That's why I think a more sustainable solution would be one where the platforms are required to make data available. So then the other researchers could analyze that data in a way Professor Leicht talked about and reproduce any analysis that comes out.
I just wanted to quickly follow on to Professor Mislove's testimony, because there are also some really perverse incentives here. So for example, Dr. Mislove is the absolute expert in Facebook, in the Facebook advertiser view, but my team engaged in a little bit of that once ourselves. We found a security vulnerability in the Facebook advertising process. I can't say too much about this, unfortunately, because it is a security vulnerability, but we reported it to Facebook. And when we did report that to Facebook, Facebook terminated our advertiser account. So we couldn't continue that work. And I know I'm not the only person that's happened to.
Yeah, so no, some of your work involved basically making Chrome add-on. And so Facebook had some bad experience with add-on tools with Cambridge Analytica and so on. So I can understand how they're a little bit reticent to let people make add-ons of various kinds.
Actually, this was totally separate from that.
No, I understand it was a different mechanism, but it's sort of a similar approach where someone claims to be doing research and in fact is doing something much more nefarious. And so I can, it will cost them money to do due diligence on people that claim that they're doing research. And so it's just one of the many tensions we're under on this. Do you think the best solution is actually not to have to rely on, essentially spyware that people opt into on their browser and just provide under controlled circumstances direct access to the huge database of all user engagement?
I mean, frankly, yes. I think moving toward a world where platforms are not the final authority on who gets to study them, that's probably a much healthier environment. I mean, tobacco companies, I forget who made this analogy earlier, but tobacco companies don't get to decide who does research on smoking. And the idea that social media companies get to decide who studies them is perverse.
Yeah, Dr. Leicht.
If I could add to that, the way social media dialogue has taken hold of in American society, social media posts and the sharing of it is really a public record of our communication with each other. So it's an awful lot like other forms of public records about communication with each other that we store in places like the Library of Congress or something. So historians someday are going to look back at this era and they're not going to have a very good perception of what's going on because they're not going to have any access to any of the original social media posts that a lot of our discussions were based on, and that's going to not be a good situation at all.
Yeah, Dr. Mislove.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that to say that it would to echo Ms. Edelson's point that the current ways that these platforms make data available often allow you to find the malicious actors on their platforms, for example, the purveyors of misinformation, right? But they don't allow you to look at the role that the platform itself plays in amplifying that information. So specifically, we try to study the algorithm, and the data made available via the ad library and other tools don't allow us to tease out what the algorithm is doing versus the malicious actors. So having a regime where Congress would require all data to be released to be able to be studied would allow us to tease out both the malicious actors as well as the role of the platform itself.
Thank you. And my time is now up. I'll recognize Representative Overt for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman Foster. So, for the second round, I'd like to take us up to 30,000 feet. We've been talking about, the specific subject matter of this hearing is how do we eliminate the barriers to data to allow researchers to conduct research into the way that misinformation spreads on social media, right? But the big goal here is to try and figure out how to stop the spread of misinformation, which a lot of people have raised different examples of how it's been destructive over the last couple of years. So, and I have to say, I'm not optimistic about this. I'm a pessimist. Ms. Edelson, you were talking about the fact that maybe Facebook has not deliberately chosen to provide misinformation. And I know Congressman Perlmutter was skeptical about that. I'm skeptical too. And I don't think it's ever going to be reasonable to think that the data that you're getting voluntarily out of these platforms is going to be unbiased. I mean, there's too big a commercial incentive there. So I'd like to talk about the business model. Let me also say that, there's been testimony that perhaps some kind of framework around users owning their own personal data would solve this problem. And I have to tell you emphatically, I don't think it will. When I was in the California legislature, I was deeply involved in the drafting of the California Consumer Privacy Act. So I know a lot about it, but the problem here is not data and its connection to users. The problem is that these companies have a business model that's based around user engagement. And they can't even articulate to you, probably in some senses, how that works, because if it's a machine learning kind of thing, it has the goal of maximizing user engagement. You might not even know that it's promoting misinformation because we don't get that kind of information back out of these algorithms. So I'm very skeptical that this is going to allow us to solve the problem. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this question. Should we be focusing more on the model? This model where Facebook and Twitter provide you this service for free. And if you don't know how it's being monetized, if you don't know what the product is, then the product is you, right? That's what economists say. And that's what it is. They're selling this user engagement. And the reason why you can't pay a monthly subscription fee to Facebook to avoid their advertising is that people would be horrified if they knew what it would cost you, how much money they're making off of each user. So here's a question to you. How do we avoid that? I mean, do we outlaw business models like this? Do we need more transparency? What's the ethical way of dealing with this issue?
That's a great question. And I think the meat of what you're asking is, how much is this a systemic issue? And I think the answer is, you're right. There is probably an inherent systemic problem with platforms that whose business model is built around maximizing user engagement. I think, I hear the tobacco company analogy a lot. I think I personally prefer maybe a pharmaceutical company analogy, because there are good things that come out of social media too, but there are certainly a lot of problems that can happen social media addiction is a very real thing. I think that we may be going toward a world where, we can acknowledge that there are good things about social media, and there are risks and there are harms, and some of these risks and harms are particularly acute for the youngest users. And I think in a framework like that, we probably need some regulation for this industry in the same way that we have regulation for pharmaceutical companies. We have regulation for banks. I think in Chairman Foster's testimony, he spoke about this analogy as well. And I think it's an apt one, where I think this is something that's important for society, but we all need much better auditing and transparency of how these platforms function.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about whether or not we need to focus more around maximizing user engagement as a business model?
I wanted to say another way of attacking the business model, or of making the business model a little bit more benign, might be to allow more competition for social media in the first place. So social media is dominated by a very small number of companies that sort of dominate the entire landscape. And if there were more competition over users themselves and users' attention, then the abuse of the users could probably be reduced somewhat, or I would think it would be at least be possible that would happen. So that might be one direction to go as well, if the business model itself can't be directly attacked.
Sure, I've thought about that too, that maybe, similar to email, when I send you an email, you and I don't both have to be on Gmail for you to read what I'm saying. And so maybe we need to think about social media a different way. When I post something, maybe it goes out to everybody and it's out there in the metaverse. And, if you choose to look at it on Facebook, that's your choice. But I don't know that that solves the bigger problem. But I mean, I really think that we as a society need to look at this and also realize, and this is the reason I'm pessimistic, realize that because there is such a strong commercial incentive, that no matter what we do, it's going to be an uphill battle. I mean, it's like counterfeit tax stamps on cigarettes, right? The commercial incentive for doing that is so strong that no matter how much resource you devote to enforcement, you're still going to have the problem. And, I think that's the ethical situation we find ourselves in with social media. Anyway, my time's expired. I'd love to continue the conversation, but thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for the fascinating discussion.
And in fact, it appears as though there are enough interested members with questions that I would entertain a third round. So if you want to get with your staff, and if you're interested, let me know and we'll consider that. I will now recognize Representative Caston for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back. Professor Leicht, in your testimony, you said that the companies have a conflict of interest with regards to researching and policing their own content, because the goal of social media companies is attention and engagement. And if extreme content produces that attention and engagement, that means more profit. We saw recently that Facebook's own internal analysis was that the majority of people who join hate groups on Facebook join at the recommendation of a Facebook algorithm. Now, I realize I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit, but to the extent that engaging with extreme content drives engagement on the site, can one reasonably assume that Facebook and other social media companies, either by individual or algorithmically, know where the extreme content is, know the consequences of the extreme content, and are actively encouraging you to engage with it?
That is certainly possible. I think that the truth is, because a lot of the sharing is done by the algorithm itself, much as Representative Overt said, they probably don't, personally know that this is happening, but they don't really do anything to stop it. So they certainly, so in that sense, especially in the extremist cases, you could be heading toward the situation Representative Perlmutter was talking about, where there's sort of almost active negligence here.
Yeah, and I guess there's a liability question there, but in a lot of other venues, if I had a high-speed trading fund that was actively profiting from, that I was anticipating, I don't know, Russia invasions of Crimea, Whether or not I did that or the algorithm did that, I might be concerned about the reputational damage that would come from my fund trading on such information, right? Let
Certainly
me,
true. Yes.
let me then take that to a more specific question, because that's a general question, but let's be very specific. A couple of weeks ago, we recognized the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And among the things we recognized was the complete heroes on Flight 93, who in a largely pre-internet era, on a plane, within 10 minutes were able to deduce that there was about to be a terrorist attack on the United States Capitol and got together to stop it. Is it reasonable to assume that in the more recent attack on the US Capitol, given how much was being amplified on Facebook, that a bunch of smart computer nerds at Facebook had knowledge a priori of what was being organized? Because those 40 people on 93 figured it out.
I think it's possible. It's also possible that nobody at Facebook actually bothered to pay attention to what their algorithms were recommending. So whether there was deliberate promotion or a better description would be, I suppose, benign neglect of what the algorithm was doing. And in either case, there are invidious problems there. You know, whether an actual person was involved or not.
I guess we get into a question, and I see Dr. Mislove and Ms. Edelson raising their hands. Let me just come in, but I do want to make clear that sometimes we get caught in our own knickers when we say, well, sure, something is immoral, but it's not illegal, so it must be okay. For my money, if I had the capability to anticipate that there was going to be an attack on the US Capitol and I didn't give a damn, there has to be some responsibility there. Shame on us if it's not illegal, but my goodness, don't look the other way. Ms. Edelson, I know I saw you wanted to comment there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is really. I worked on Wall Street on 9/11. That was a bad day. It was a really, really bad day. And I remember the morning of January 6th because I told my team that morning that I thought it was going to be a bad day because this is what I live and breathe. I look at this stuff every day and it's awful. I don't know if anyone at Facebook knew it was going to be a bad day. I don't work there. But one of the things we do know is that their internal research has been telling them about the extremist problem for years. They knew that their algorithm was promoting hateful and extremist content. They knew that there were fixes. They knew that those fixes might come at the cost of user engagement, and they chose not to put those fixes into place. So as to whether anyone knew on January 6th, I don't know, but they knew about the problem. They knew how to fix it, and they chose not to.
Thank you. I yield back unless the chair would like to allow Dr. Mislove to comment.
Yeah, if you can give it 30 seconds.
I'll just add on that the fact that your question goes at the heart of this hearing, which is that it's a question we don't know the answer to, and as researchers, as outsiders, we don't have the ability to answer to. So essentially, it's really pointing out exactly why legislation in this area really is needed. I will say that what we do know is that when we have run political ads, we became a political advertiser and ran that. We do see exactly the echo chambers that could lead to these sorts of things. When we run ads, they deliver more right-wing messages towards more right-wing users and vice versa for left-wing messages. So we know the algorithm has these effects, and it's incredibly important that we understand how those are playing out in the ways that you're alluding to.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'll recognize Mr. Perlmutter for 5 minutes.
All right. Well, that exchange was particularly sobering. Sean, nice questions. I think you mentioned one thing about reputational damage, and Professor Leicht, talked about the market control that these companies have. If you're a monopolist, it's hard to have reputational damage. I mean, you got it. You're it. It doesn't matter. There's nobody else to go to. So my question is much more kind of baseline for me. In the introduction, I don't know if it was Bill that talked about it or one of the panelists talked about sort of the ability to study Twitter versus the ability to study some of the others, particularly Facebook. Can somebody explain that to me, that it was expensive for Twitter, but at least it was possible? So I just open it to the panelists.
So Twitter has a what's called the Firehose API. You can buy access to, all of Twitter, well, a fraction of it. And there are researchers who do this, but it is quite expensive to use. There are also some members of this committee will appreciate the replicability issues that we face because there's some issues with data portability. But this is why Twitter is the best studied platform. Alan?
And we have historically gotten access to exactly that Firehose API, which is really useful, and Twitter deserves credit for making that available. I will note, though, that it is an incomplete view. It doesn't cover many of the ad targeting information that we've talked about in this hearing. It doesn't cover delivery information and so forth. It really lets you get a view of a random fraction of the public content shared on Twitter.
And then CrowdTangle has a view to public pages and groups on Facebook and Instagram, and there is both a web portal and an API. That's what folks who ingest large volumes of data, such as I used to do, use. And then for platforms like YouTube, we really don't have anything. There's just, that really is a black box. TikTok is a black box.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
And this has been, I just want to say this has been fascinating. I've got to leave, but if we have some follow-up hearing at some point, I think it would be fantastic. So thanks to the panelists.
Thank you. And let's see, it's my understanding that Representative Ober-Nolte and potentially Mr. Kasten are up for another round of questions. Is that all right? All right. Well, then I think that's a quorum for that, and we'll proceed. Let's see. So when you think about data portability standards, imagine that you're some startup social media firm. Putting all of this apparatus on top of you is going to be a huge operational cost. And so, it seems likely that we're going to have to make this, okay, until you've got 1 million users or something like that, to have a very light touch on this. But at some point, we're going to have to scale the mandates here. And so one way to make that less of a burden is to actually from the start have data portability and access standards that they can design their software around. So from the start, they can know that when we get big, our data layout and so on is compatible with that. Is that something that's been thought about? Just if any of you can grab onto that. Otherwise, there's a danger that we'll just squeeze everyone but the big players out of the business with a bunch of burdensome requirements.
So I, along with some other researchers at Mozilla and with the Wesleyan Media Project, as I mentioned, we published a technical standard for universal ad transparency. There's a preprint that's available right now. I'd be happy to send it to you. We will be publishing it more formally soon. When we looked at this issue, what we actually found is that we think it will be less expensive for platforms to comply with just general data access than it would be for them to have to build the large public web portals that companies like Facebook and to a lesser extent Google do provide for ads, because just shipping data is not actually that expensive as long as there is a standard format that they can comply with. There's a different question here if we're talking about other forms of non-ad data, organic data, because the volumes of data get really, really large. The recommendation, so this is something that I am working on developing a technical standard for. I think our recommendation will likely not require an archive. I think the recommendation that we'll be making in a paper I'm developing is for public access. So we could come to a place where there is programmatic access to the same content that is publicly available and meet some other thresholds. And that is given again to, to researchers who have registered for a program. And I think again, as long as there is a standard in place, complying wouldn't be terribly expensive. I do think there is a competitiveness concern. So I do think that probably there's going to be a minimum size threshold that goes into place. But I think you are right that the research community needs to do more here.
And when you talk about, sort of people's right to have access to their data, one of the big problems there is that a lot of the data is purchased from third parties. And so what you're going to have to get to is sort of an identifier for people, some unique identifier for people that they can stand up and say, here, this is Bill Foster, here's my, whatever my identifier is. And everyone who has passed around data on me will have a duty to respond to that request. And if they've sold it to someone, or if you purchased it, you're going to have to maintain sort of the chain of custody of who sold the data to who, and keep that identifier around and keep up a response, a duty to respond to that sort of request, either for access to your own data or deletion of that data. And have people tried to write down such a system, how that would work, how you'd avoid things like identity fraud and people stealing your entire data set by claiming they were you? Have people attempted that sort of to design systems like that?
I can speak a little bit to this if that was to the panel. We've actually done a decent amount of work looking at the data broker industry, which is sort of where these concerns that you're bringing up are sort of the most acute. In fact, many of the data brokers have actually partnered historically with social media platforms for the purposes of ad targeting, so that I could target people on Facebook using data broker derived attributes. And so the upshot of all of that is that there, in terms of the unique identifier, the industry is already doing this. They needed to join the Facebook identifiers with the Experian identifiers, and we know that they're able to do it, even though the information about how exactly they did it is public. But in terms of sort of the identity theft, concerns you raise, that is absolutely a real concern. I will say that there is a little bit of transparency on the data broker industry. There are certain sites where you can go to see a limited snapshot of your data, and on those sites they have identity verification procedures in place. So I'm not concerned that that's not a solvable problem, that this has already been solved in other contexts. And so if there were regulation in this area, I think that would, the technical problems wouldn't be the ones that would come first.
Thank you. And we'll now recognize Representative Overt for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Foster. Dr. Leicht, if I could ask you about something that was in your written testimony that I found very interesting. You were talking about how research indicates that one of the primary catalysts for the spread of misinformation is our inability as humans to process an overabundance of information. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on that for a minute, and then maybe throw out some possible solutions to that problem.
Yeah, so well, unfortunately, that's a problem of the end user. So there's some research that suggests that a lot of misinformation is spread not necessarily because a person is intending to spread misinformation, but because they're bombarded with so much information, they're not spending time to cognitively process what they see, so they just forward on posts that look interesting or attractive. And that's, that I think is a problem that psychologists have been talking about for years, not only with social media, but in other areas where we're just overloaded with information all the time. And so our ability to process it isn't very good. One of the solutions to that seems to be to sort of interrupt the automatic process that seems to go on when we read social media sites. So one of the promises of labeling is that if you're reading a set of social media posts and then you come upon something that's labeled, that actually jars you out of this tendency to want to immediately share something. It's you to think about whether you want to share it or not. And so it actually slows the process down. And that's a way then to get people to think about a specific thing they're reading and not necessarily this specific thing is one of 200 things I'm reading and they're all the same. So this is going to be a pervasive problem that is going to be very hard to deal with. But some forms of labeling may help interrupt the process so that just automatic sharing using essentially our brain stems is stopped.
Interesting. So, I mean, what you're talking about is kind of a supply side solution to the problem where social media companies would be interjecting this in a in a deliberate effort to combat the spread of misinformation. But I'm wondering if there might be a demand side solution. And Dr. Mislove, maybe I'll ask you about this. Is part of the solution perhaps increasing our technological literacy? So, in other words, when, we know that alcohol addiction is a problem in society, right? So we solve that problem, to the extent that we have solved it. We solve it with education, right? If you know you've got alcoholism that runs in your family because there's the genetic component, if you know that alcoholism can occur, perhaps that you're a little bit more careful about monitoring how many drinks you take, right? And so I'm wondering if isn't an educational component, like we make people aware of this phenomenon of how misinformation spreads. We make people aware that you've got confirmation bias, and so that makes you, when you read a piece of misinformation that fits right into your worldview, you're more likely to believe it. And in that way, maybe we encourage people to verify the veracity of something before they share it. I mean, is there anything to that, or or does it have to be a supply side solution?
I think it's a great question. I'll admit it's not my area, so I am truly, and I'll defer to some of the other panelists to perhaps provide a more detailed answer. But I would think so, and I think I'll point you to. I know Twitter has recently done a number of things where if you go to retweet something but you haven't clicked the link, it will ask you, "Are you sure you want to do that? Maybe you should read the article first." And so it seems like those are
maybe you should go to Snopes as well.
Maybe you should go to Snopes as well. So I think those are inching in the direction of what you're talking about. But some of the other witnesses may have a more detailed answer.
Sure. Anyone else?
The only thing I'll say is that I suspect some kind of demand side solution, as you refer to it, is going to be necessary, but we don't know what that will look like. It could come in a wide range of forms, and this is actually one of the reasons we need data, because we really do need to start working on solutions, and we need an answer to that question.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. It's been a really fascinating hearing. And thank you, Mr. Foster, for catalyzing this whole discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I yield back.
Thank you. And we'll now recognize Representative Caston.
Thank you. And I echo that this has just been fascinating. And I'm sorry you didn't have the full committee and everybody participating, but I'm actually kind of glad, because we've gotten to follow up and go into a little bit more depth than we usually do. Ms. Edelson, shortly after you released your results, which found that people who rely on Facebook for information have substantially lower vaccination rates than those who rely on other sources, Facebook cut off your access to data. I think your research said that people who rely exclusively on Facebook for news, 25% of them do not intend to get vaccinated. Now, I understand, and I appreciate in your text, I think you said Facebook is using privacy as a pretext to squelch research that it considers inconvenient. And that, I worry sometimes that sounds like, well, we don't do some research. How much does that really matter? I realize we're all math and science nerds here, at least since Mr. Perlmutter has not been able to continue. But at core, this is an epidemiological question, right? If we know that certain behaviors increase the rate of spread of a communicable disease, the rate of contraction of communicable disease, there are consequences. And you do epidemiology right, people live. You do it wrong, people die. Can you speak at all to the consequences of your inability to do, what is it, core epidemiological research?
So I just want to first say the study you're referencing, although it certainly aligns with my work, was done by David Lazar. That's excellent work that I can recommend. But yeah, I think you're right. Misinformation, I'm willing to say this, misinformation is killing people. We have had a safe and effective vaccine for COVID for a long time now. we're back over 2,000 deaths a day. Facebook is not the only reason this is happening, but it's certainly contributing because of exactly that study you cite and that I personally keep in mind. Right now, there is vaccine misinformation that is widespread and easily available on Facebook. I know this because I have colleagues who still do have access to Facebook who find it and try to report it every day. And it's really, really hard for those folks because they do not feel like the platforms are their allies in this. And again, this is something that Facebook's own research has pointed to, and Facebook has just chosen not to fix.
I feel like we're back where we were in the last line of question. They know they are causing harm and choosing not to act. I see a lot of head nods. I'm just getting depressed, so I'm reluctant to ask any more questions. But Dr. Leicht, Dr. Mislove, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of briefly echo exactly everything Ms. Edelson said and say that, essentially what you're trying to get at is, how do we fix this? And we've talked in this hearing about a number of, supply side, demand side, and so forth. But ultimately, I feel like as a scientist, I need to be able to diagnose the problem before I can, understand how to design fixes that will address the problem. And currently, we don't have the tools able to do that. We don't know how much of the role that the platform is playing versus the malicious actors that were referred to earlier. And so I think, for me, sort of going with the phrase, sunlight's the best disinfectant, just being able to understand it can then enable us to develop, mitigations, regulations, whatever it is that would address the issues that we're seeing.
Just to follow up with that, if the platforms wanted to do one thing today to help start to deal with this problem, reinstating my account, broadening access to CrowdTangle, would be the most immediate steps they could take, because there are many researchers who want to find answers. They want to be part of the solution, and Facebook is just refusing any help.
At the risk of being crass, it would seem to be the bare minimum to demonstrate that they give a damn. Thank you all. This has been truly fascinating, and I yield back.
Thank you. And before we bring the hearing to a close, I just want to also thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. The witnesses are now formally excused and the hearing is now adjourned.